Stop calling it debt trap diplomacy. You are missing the point. China isn't trying to buy Africa. China is trying to hide in it. Here is the brutal math that terrifies Beijing. China is a geographical prisoner. They have 20% of the world's people, but only 7% of the arable land. If the US Navy blocks one single strait in Southeast Asia, China starves in 90 days. Africa is not a business opportunity, it is an emergency exit. China is building a civilization backup drive, a supply chain the West cannot cut, a pantry that cannot be sanctioned, and a vote bank that cannot be ignored. They aren't expanding, they are digging a bunker, and they are using the entire African continent to do it.
To understand why Chinese engineers are currently pouring concrete in a remote village in Kenya, you have to go back to a bonfire in Beijing in the year 1433. Most geopolitical analysts start the clock on China's rise in 2013. They are wrong. The clock started ticking 600 years ago. In the early 15th century, the Ming dynasty didn't just have a navy, they had a floating city. Admiral Zheng He commanded the treasure fleet, over 300 ships, manned by 28,000 sailors. These weren't primitive rafts. His flagship was 400 feet long. For context, Christopher Columbus's Santa Maria, which sailed 80 years later, was only 60 feet long. You could fit Columbus's entire ship on the deck of Zheng He's flagship and still have room to play a game of soccer. China had the technology to colonize Australia, the Americas, and Africa before Europe had even figured out how to leave the Mediterranean. They controlled the Indian Ocean. They were the undisputed masters of the world. And then they committed geopolitical suicide. In 1433, the imperial court looked at the map and made the most fatal calculation in human history. They decided that China was the Zhonggu, the Middle Kingdom. They believed they were the center of the universe, self-sufficient, and that the outside world had nothing to offer them but barbarism. So they burned the fleet. They destroyed the dry docks. They burned the blueprints so no one could ever build ships that size again. They issued the Haijin, the sea ban, making it a capital crime to build a boat with more than 2 masts. China went to sleep for 5 centuries. While they slept, Europe woke up. The British, the Portuguese, and the Dutch built smaller, uglier ships, but they put cannons on them. When the British arrived in 1839 for the First Opium War, China was helpless. The British ironclad warship, the Nemesis, sailed up the Yangtze River and shattered the Chinese military without scratching its paint. The result was the century of humiliation. The West flooded China with opium, creating 15 million addicts. They carved up Chinese territory. Japan invaded and brutalized the population. The Middle Kingdom was brought to its knees because it had cut itself off from the world. This is the psychological scar that drives the Chinese Communist Party today. They have internalized a brutal lesson. Isolation is not safety. Isolation is death. Fast forward to the modern era. The Communist Party made a promise to its people. We will make you rich and we will never be humiliated again. For decades, they kept that promise using their own resources. The massive Docking oil field in northeast China pumped enough black gold to fuel the entire country's industrialization. China was energy independent. But in 1993, the math broke. China's economy was growing so fast, building factories, paving highways, electrifying cities, that they drank the Docking field dry. In 1993, for the first time in modern history, China became a net importer of oil. The Middle Kingdom myth shattered again. Suddenly, the survival of the regime didn't depend on Beijing, it depended on oil from the Middle East. This created the strategic nightmare that haunts Xi Jinping to this day, the Malacca Dilemma. To get oil from the Persian Gulf to Shanghai, tankers must pass through the Strait of Malacca. It is a narrow shipping lane between Malaysia and Indonesia. At its narrowest point, it is only 1.7 miles wide. The problem? The United States Navy effectively controls that water. Chinese military strategists looked at this choke point and realized the truth. China is a prisoner. In a conflict over Taiwan, the US doesn't need to invade the mainland. They don't need to fire a single missile at Beijing. They just have to park 2 destroyers in the Strait of Malacca and turn off the tap. Day 1, the oil stops flowing. Day 60, the strategic reserves run dry. Day 90, the trucks stop moving food, the lights go out in Shanghai, and the regime collapses. The Communist Party realized their entire economic miracle was built on a supply chain they didn't own, protected by a navy they couldn't defeat. They needed a way out. They needed a second lung. They needed energy sources that weren't controlled by the West and supply lines that didn't rely on the Pacific Ocean. They looked at the map and they saw the one place the West had abandoned, Africa. In the 1990s, the West was leaving Africa. The Cold War was over. Western oil companies like Shell and Exxon were terrified of African instability. They didn't want to drill in Sudan because of the civil war. They didn't want to touch Angola because of the corruption. Shareholders in New York demanded safety. China saw a vacuum. Beijing launched the Go Out policy, Suchaku. The order to state-owned companies was simple. Go where the Americans won't. Buy what the Europeans are too afraid to touch. Secure the resources at any cost. They didn't go to Africa for charity. They went because they were terrified of starving. This was the moment the strategy shifted. Phase 1 was about oil and survival. But what happened next was even more ambitious. China realized that just buying oil wasn't enough. To truly be safe, they needed to own the infrastructure. They needed to own the ports, the roads, and the political loyalty of the continent. They weren't just looking for a gas station. They were building a fortress.
While the West was busy celebrating the end of the Cold War, they made a fatal mistake in Africa. They thought the game was over. In the 1990s, the United States and Europe looked at Africa and saw only liabilities. They saw civil wars, corruption, and poverty. Western oil giants like Shell, BP, and Exxon were terrified. Their shareholders in London and New York demanded safety. They demanded ethical standards. They couldn't do business with dictators because a single bad headline on CNN would destroy their stock price. So the West pulled back. They closed embassies, they cut aid, they left a massive geopolitical vacuum. And nature abhors a vacuum. China stepped in, and they didn't bring a lecture about democracy. They brought a checkbook. Beijing introduced a foreign policy weapon that changed the world. It's called non-interference. It works like this. When an African leader asked the International Monetary Fund for a loan to build a road, the West said, first, you must hold free elections. You must cut corruption. You must protect human rights. Then, maybe we will give you the money. China said, we don't care how you treat your people. We don't care if you steal half the money. We want the oil. We will build the road today. The test case was Sudan. In the mid-90s, Sudan was a pariah state. It was torn apart by a brutal civil war. The U.S. had sanctioned the regime for terrorism. Western companies fled. China moved in. They didn't just drill for oil. They sent the People's Liberation Army, disguised as security contractors, to guard the wells. They built the pipelines, they built the refineries, they pumped billions into a regime the rest of the world had rejected. The result? Sudan began shipping millions of barrels of oil to China. The West screamed about morality. China just counted the barrels. But the real game changer happened in Angola. In 2002, Angola emerged from a 27-year civil war. The country was flattened. The government was broke. They went to the West for help. The IMF offered a loan, but with strict austerity measures attached. They told a starving country to spend less money. Then, China walked in with a counteroffer that terrified the World Bank. It became known as the Angola Model. China Exim Bank wrote a check for $2 billion overnight. But here is the genius part. Not a single dollar touched an Angolan bank account. The money went directly from the Chinese bank to Chinese construction companies. Chinese workers flew in by the thousands. They built the roads, the railways, and the hospitals. And how did Angola pay them back? Not with cash. They paid with oil equity. It was the perfect closed loop. China got the oil, Angola got the infrastructure, and the West got locked out. By 2010, Angola, a country the West had written off, was China's #1 supplier of crude oil, beating Saudi Arabia. This wasn't just business. It was a coup. China proved to every dictator and president in the global South that they didn't need the West anymore. They had a new banker, a banker who didn't ask questions. But oil was just the fuel. What they were about to do next would make the oil deals look like pocket change. They were about to corner the market on the future of technology itself. While the United States was fighting wars in the Middle East to secure the last century's energy source, China was quietly buying the next one. Around 2010, the Communist Party realized that the age of oil was ending. They saw the writing on the wall. The future wasn't going to be powered by combustion engines, it was going to be powered by batteries. Electric vehicles, fighter jets, iPhones, wind turbines, they all rely on a specific set of critical minerals: cobalt, lithium, and copper. Western politicians started giving speeches about the green energy transition. They told their voters that switching to renewables would finally free them from the dictators in the Middle East. They thought that by ditching oil, they were breaking the chains of geopolitics. They were wrong. They were just walking into a different cage. China looked at the map and realized that the Saudi Arabia of electric vehicles wasn't in the Persian Gulf. It was in the rainforests of Central Africa. The Democratic Republic of Congo sits on nearly 70% of the world's cobalt supply. You simply cannot build a modern battery without it. If you control the Congo, you control the ignition switch of the 21st century. In 2016, the United States made a mistake that historians will likely study for decades. One of the largest copper and cobalt mines in the world, the Tenke Fungurume mine in the DRC, was owned by an American company, Freeport-McMoRan. But the company was in debt and copper prices were down. They wanted to sell. In a normal world, the US government would have stepped in. They would have said, no, you cannot sell a strategic asset to our greatest rival. But Washington was asleep at the wheel. They saw it as just a business deal. So China Molybdenum, a state-backed giant, stepped in and bought the mine for $2.65 billion. Overnight, the United States lost its foothold in the most important supply chain of the future. Today, 15 of the 19 largest cobalt mines in the Congo are owned or financed by Chinese firms. But here is the truly terrifying part. It's not just about the rocks. Anyone can dig up a rock. The real power is in the chemistry. Lithium and cobalt are useless when they come out of the ground. They have to be refined, processed, and turned into battery-grade chemicals. It is a dirty, toxic, and expensive process. The West shut down its refineries because of environmental regulations. They didn't want the pollution. China said, give us the pollution. We will take the waste. The result? Today, China controls nearly 85% of the world's capacity to process rare earth minerals. Think about what that means.
Even if the US Army invaded the Congo tomorrow and seized every single mine, it wouldn't matter. They would still have to ship the rocks to China to turn them into batteries. China has achieved vertical integration of the global economy. The West is building the cars, the West is designing the phones, but China holds the keys, and if they ever decide to lock the door, the green revolution dies in the dark. This is the green chokehold, and it is already tight.
People talk about debt trap diplomacy, the idea that China lends money to poor countries to seize their ports when they go bankrupt. That is small thinking. That is 20th century thinking. Phase 4 is not about seizing a port. It is about seizing the nervous system. While the West was worrying about the debt, China was building the digital Silk Road. Here is the reality on the ground. 70% of Africa's 4G networks were built by Huawei. If you are reading this on a smartphone in Africa, there is a 1 in 2 chance that phone was made by Transsion, a Chinese company that sells more phones in Africa than Samsung and Apple combined. Why does this matter? Because if you build the network, you own the data. China is hardwiring 54 African nations into its own digital ecosystem. They are laying the undersea cables that carry the internet traffic. They are building the server farms that store the government records. They are exporting the state operating system. In countries like Zimbabwe and Uganda, Chinese companies are installing safe city technology. These are thousands of cameras linked to facial recognition AI. The government says it's for crime, but the technology is identical to what is used in Xinjiang. It allows autocrats to track dissent, monitor protests, and silence opposition. China isn't just exporting concrete, they are exporting authoritarianism as a service. And this digital grip leads directly to the final, most terrifying pillar of the strategy, the Atlantic pivot. For 70 years, the United States has kept China boxed in behind the first island chain in the Pacific. The U.S. Navy controls the waters off Japan, Taiwan, and the Philippines. China has been trapped in its own backyard. Africa is the escape hatch. In 2017, China opened its first overseas military base in Djibouti on the east coast of Africa. The West shrugged. They said it was for anti-piracy. But intelligence reports now show China is aggressively pursuing a naval base on the Atlantic coast, likely in Equatorial Guinea or Gabon. If they succeed, it changes the military map of the world forever. A Chinese naval base on the Atlantic Ocean means Chinese nuclear submarines and aircraft carriers can project power directly opposite the east coast of the United States. It turns the Atlantic Ocean, which has been a NATO lake since World War II, into a contested war zone. It breaks the American containment strategy. It puts the Chinese Navy in Washington's rearview mirror. The endgame, the civilization backup drive. This brings us to the year 2050. By 2050, 1 in 4 people on Earth will be African. The West sees a refugee crisis. China sees the only growing market left in the world. China's own population is shrinking. They are getting old before they get rich. They have excess factories and no one to buy their goods. Africa is the solution. It is the young, booming consumer base that will keep the Chinese economy alive when the West declines. They have secured the energy, oil. They have secured the future tech, Cobalt, lithium. They have secured the data, Huawei. They have secured the military flank, the Atlantic. And finally, they have secured the vote bank. There are 54 African nations in the United Nations. That is 28% of the General Assembly. When the UN tries to condemn China for human rights abuses, African nations vote no. China has effectively bought diplomatic immunity. China isn't trying to colonize Africa. They are becoming Africa. They have built a supply chain the US Navy cannot cut. They have built a market Western sanctions cannot touch. They burned the fleet once. They learned their lesson. They are building a fortress that spans 2 continents, and this time the doors are staying open, but only for them.
So, where does this end? It ends with a fundamental shift in the Earth's center of gravity. For 500 years, the world revolved around the Atlantic Ocean. Europe and America wrote the rules. They set the time zones, they drew the borders, they printed the money. That era is over. While the West has been distracted by its own internal politics, China has been playing a game of Go, an ancient board game where the goal is not to capture the enemy's king, but to surround him until he cannot move. Look at the board today. China controls the supply chain, the minerals. China controls the infrastructure, the ports and rails. China controls the communication, the 5G. China controls the debt, the banks. The United States is still the world's largest military power, but in the 21st century, you don't need to blow up a country to conquer it. You just need to be the only one who can turn its lights on. The West sees Africa as a charity case to be saved with mosquito nets and food aid. China sees Africa as a business partner to be integrated. And here is the hardest pill to swallow. For many African leaders, the Chinese model is winning. Democracy is messy. It is slow. It requires compromise. The Chinese model is fast. It is efficient. It builds a hospital in 3 months. It builds a dam in 3 years. China is exporting the idea that freedom is the price you pay for prosperity. And in a continent where millions are still waiting for electricity, that is a price many are willing to pay. In 1433, China burned its fleet and hid behind a wall. They paid for it with centuries of humiliation. Today, they have learned the lesson. They aren't hiding anymore. They have built a new Great Wall. But this one isn't made of stone. It is made of cobalt, fiber optic cables, and naval bases. And it doesn't surround China. It surrounds the West. The sleeping giant didn't just wake up.
It packed its bags and moved to the future. And while we were sleeping, they took the keys. But there is one massive flaw in China's plan. There is one ticking time bomb inside their own economy that could bring this entire empire crashing down before 2030. It is the one thing Xi Jinping cannot build, buy, or steal. If you want to know what it is and why this grand strategy might actually be a suicide mission, make sure you are subscribed and have notifications on. I'm dropping that deep dive next. Share this video if you think the world needs to wake up. I'll see you in the comments.